Great, thank you. And just before I introduce you, first of all, thank you, both of you, for making the time to attend this this training program. Really grateful that you could join us. But just to say that the High Representative Jimé Adoum won't be able to join us. He's stuck in air travel issues, so he sends his regrets. Today is a bit of a continuation of this morning's discussion. Michael, Alexandre, this morning with other guest speakers, we started talking about the global impact of conflict and obviously of the conflict in Ukraine in particular. And we also, that's the starting point for today's discussion, but as we discuss, we'll focus even more so, given your backgrounds, and I'll come back to that, we'll focus a bit more on what the international institutions can do, what the multilateral institutions can do to help countries weather those storms and manage the effects of conflicts to which they're obviously not a party, but they're suffering the consequences. So for this discussion, we're very excited to have Alexandre, Marc, and Michael Schaeffer. So Alexandre is the Chief Specialist for Fragility, Conflict and Violence at the World Bank, where he provides strategic advice to around 30 World Bank country teams around the world operating in fragile states. And you have the bio. I just wanted to emphasize two other points. One is that before working at the World Bank, Alexandre did some consulting on Africa with Oxford University. And the second point is, and again, another shameless plug on my part, since we're in the Dag Hammarskjöld room, and we're working here under the gentle and wise gaze of Dag Hammarskjöld, the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation will actually release tomorrow a report on UN leadership. And I'm saying this because Alexandre, Marc was kind enough to also contribute to this publication, and you'll see we will happily share the publication with you. It's different perspectives on UN leadership, and Alexandre, Marc contributed a very thoughtful piece. So I also want to take this opportunity to thank you, Alexandre, for doing this, and we're looking forward to the publication that will be released tomorrow. We're also very happy to welcome Michael Schaeffer, who recently left the World Bank, his last post was as a country representative in Libya. Michael, Libya has been talked about already a few times already this week. It'll be really interesting to have your perspectives on Libya, but Michael also has a long and distinguished career at the World Bank and the IMF, different roles, but as senior public finance advisor, investment management advisors across Africa, but all in particular in East Africa. Again, more details on both of them in your booklet. So thank you again for joining us. I just wanted to start by saying that in preparation for this panel, I was going through the daily news updates that we get at the UN, and it's sobering to see how often this issue of impact on a number of countries in Africa in particular comes up, and there's not a day now where the Secretary General doesn't speak to the urgency of supporting countries around the world and in Africa in particular in managing these storms. Just a few sobering numbers, and I know, for example, UNHCR was at the EU last week. A delegation went to the EU to talk about the dire consequences, the food security situation in the Sahel. Only yesterday, the UN announced that you were looking at potentially 350,000 children dying of hunger in East Africa by the summer, and that 28 million people are at increased risk. That's an astounding number, and the Economist also, some of you may have seen, had an interesting piece also last week on the economic consequences in Latin America. Some of those were discussed this morning. So obviously, I think we've already talked about how some of these problems are homegrown, have causes that are domestic causes, but they're obviously exacerbated by a series of shocks, the pandemic, and now the war in Ukraine. So, as I said, it would be interesting to focus today's discussion, Alexandre and Michael, on the role of the institutional organizations and multilateral institutions. But I just wanted to start us off and ask both of you because we started discussing with other speakers this morning, before we get into the role of these organizations, like just your take on what's happening when it comes to the ripple effects of the war in Ukraine on countries such as Libya or other countries that you are working in or working on. And then maybe we can pivot to the role of international institutions. Alexandre, can we start with you and maybe ask you for your overall take on what's happening and what, especially in Africa, and how they are weathering these storms, and what's your read on the current situation, and what these countries could or should be doing to manage these effects. Alexandre, over to you.
Okay. Yes, with pleasure. I just want to say one little thing before we start, that actually I left my position as chief specialist for conflict at the bank 2 years ago to join Brookings, but I'm working on the same type of issues and still very much connected to what's happening at the World Bank and IMF. So the first thing I think that we have to mention to understand the conflict in Ukraine is how different this conflict is to all our theories of conflict that we had drawn since the end of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Berlin Wall. First of all, this is two conflict between two states, and this had not happened. Conflict between states had basically disappeared since 2010, more or less. The last one was the invasion of Iraq by the US, but there was also a couple of them, the Eritrea-Ethiopia conflict and so on. But these were conflict that were not at the scope of this one. Most of the conflict were seen as happening with fragile countries with very non-industrialized country or lightly industrialized country, and countries that had huge internal issue of governance. And that was the whole theory of conflict, was based about that, and all the work on prevention and all the sort of strategic direction, the World Bank, the UN, and other institutions that were actually summarized into the Pathway for Peace report that we published in 2018, UN and World Bank together. So it's a very different type of conflict. And that explains in part why it has such a deep ripple effect. It happens with two important industrialized countries, and that are especially important exporters for the rest of the world. Ukraine is a very big exporter of grain, but all sorts of other outputs that are necessary for agriculture in a very globalized world. And Russia is the exporter of massive amount of natural resources. So that makes a huge difference. When you apply sanction to a country like Sudan or others, it's very different than when you apply sanction to a country like Russia, obviously. But this is probably the new direction we're going in, right? Because in the last few years, there has been a huge change in the dynamic of conflict due to the change in the geopolitics organization of the world. So we might have more of those.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, no, great. Alexandre, thanks for setting the scene. And I think I want to go back at one point to what you're alluding to, which is how equipped, the UN, the World Bank, and other institutions are to deal with these new situations, whether there's a need to fundamentally rethink our toolbox. So hold on to that thought. Michael, over to you on your overall read of the current situation and the impact in Africa. You just left your post in Libya. If you can perhaps, if you want, speak to the impact on an already extremely difficult situation in Libya or other countries that you've been working on or looking at. Over to you.
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to everybody in New York, and Alexandre, Marc. I didn't really see you at the bank, but I actually have seen your work throughout. Okay, so
I've seen you in the hotel in Tunis. We had a few discussions.
So it's been a while. Let me be frank with the team that's in New York. My name is Michael Schaeffer. I'm actually not Marwan El-Abbasi. Marwan El-Abbasi is the central bank governor of Tunisia and former representative for the World Bank. I'm actually more handsome than Marwan, and probably I'm a good follower and a friend of Marwan El-Abbasi. On this one too, I want to also explain that we have a book coming out soon, I guess, on Libya, The Long Road to Inclusive Institutions. And that's I guess, a World Bank appropriate name, because you cannot use anything much more dynamic like that. I think that's kind of fits in with the World Bank scenario. The book took almost as long as the conflict has been going on to get going there. And in this book, we actually have different units in there discussing different things like UNHCR, WFP, the social protection team, obviously the World Bank macro team. And I did a lot there in Libya. In effect, in Libya itself, I was there for virtually every single budget meeting that they had between the East and West for the last 5 or 6 years, trying to bring the two institutions together. And I would consider my role not as country rep for Libya, but more as marriage counselor to divergent forces in Libya driving these various East-West conflict. Now, I think what you have are almost like winners and losers in this game in Ukraine. And Alexandre, Marc, you actually put this out, okay? I think Libya is actually going to be a winner in this in some ways, okay? They're going to lose on the grain prices, and they're going to lose on grain imports. They're going to have to deal with that. But in some senses, they're actually a winner because oil prices have gone up, okay? So they're actually pulling in, getting more volume on oil being exported, and they're actually getting better prices. So you can actually see that in foreign exchange reserves and things like this too. Now, I think you've laid it out exactly appropriately. You have a large country, Ukraine, battling East and West. We've gone back to maybe a little bit of the Cold War thing in a very big way from a number of years ago. But you also have to look at the smaller dynamic conflicts going on in like the Middle East and other places. And I think what's happened with Ukraine is, from my perspective only, and I'm a contrarian by nature, I'm a heretic by upbringing, I think we've forgotten a lot about the other conflicts that are there and the dynamics of the other conflicts that are going on in light of the very large spotlight that's been put on Ukraine. It's an important spotlight, but we've lost sight of this. Now, putting this in perspective, being the heretic or the contrarian that I am as a country rep, I honestly felt, okay, as I go back, that we didn't really have the appropriate tools in dealing with some of the fragility conflicts, things like this in Libya. I mean, Alexandre, you may have disagreed with me on this one. I'm not sure we have the tools, okay? Because the conflict has shifted in many ways, like Libya itself, and which I'm a little bit more familiar with, is sort of a middle-income country at conflict in over 10 years, okay? How do you deal with that? I think I was spending more time dealing with the World Bank lawyers. Which government are you dealing with? De facto, de jure, which one, okay? And so, the nature of the conflict has changed, okay? It's also shifted to a lot of middle-income countries as well. And I think Ukraine has really shifted the spotlight to Ukraine, but that means we're beginning to forget a lot of the conflicts that are already simmering. And I'm not clear whether we've designed appropriate solutions or not to remedy what's going on there, okay? I'm not sure, the UN has a different mandate than the World Bank per se. So I'm not sure the World Bank has the appropriate tools in their tool chest to really deal with those things going on there. I'll leave that to you for a moment as kind of an opening gambit for a broader discussion. Let me leave it that way. Over to you, please.
Thanks, Michael. So a few issues, and let's try to maybe take them one at a time. One is the issue of opportunities. You mentioned Libya seizing this as perhaps, or seeing this as an opportunity for Libya because of oil prices. The second is whether what the UN, the World Bank, and others can do to help other countries across Africa that might not be as lucky as Libya although I think put the words lucky and Libya in the same sentence is a bit challenging. But I want to touch on what the UN and the World Bank should or could be doing, and other institutions, by the way, the EU, we have the EU represented here, regional development banks, what they can do to help African countries weather these different storms. And the third issue you bring up, Michael, is the issue of our toolbox for the new nature of conflict in middle-income countries. So I want to make sure we have time, because I think that's a fascinating issue also for our audience today. But can I just now ask both of you to maybe pursue a little bit the question of opportunities for some of these countries that are currently affected by the country? Is it odd to ask that question, that there might actually be opportunities to seize in the current environment for these countries that are affected by the war in Ukraine? Or is this something we should be giving more thought to? Alexandre, do you want to start?
Yeah, so, it's really interesting how we European and American tend to see things very, we're very centric about our vision of the world, right? So, but you can see that outside of Europe and maybe a few of their closest allies in Asia, everybody is trying to see, okay, what's going to be out of all this, good for me or not? How should I position my view, my need in the future? We have to remember that a lot of the growth in Latin America has happened during the Second World War because of the war. They exported like never. Countries like Argentina's were booming at that time. Others were contributing. But when you have such a large war, you have immediately pro and cons, and that makes everything much more complex. And wanting immediately countries to join one side or the other is very naive, because countries have to discuss and see really what they are into, not only in terms of immediate opportunities, which are very straightforward, like prices of oil or prices of grains, but in things like how I'm going to associate myself with some of those actors in the middle term. What can I gain from it? We know that some countries like Mali or Central African Republic were already choosing to a much stronger collaboration with Russia before what happened now, and maybe seeing Russia flexing so much its muscle on the international scene will reinforce their view that they should be more involved with those countries, and therefore it will reinforce countries like Mali or Central African Republic in the idea that they should go more with the Russian than the French. So what you see now at the moment is a complete realignment and about how things are going to work economically, geopolitically, in terms of future alliance, present alliance. Everybody is outside from the I would say the core European, American, Japanese, and what we can call the Western bloc. Outside of that, actually, every country is trying to see what's in for them and what's not in for them. So I think you see that at a massive scale, and I don't think you have seen that to that point ever since the Second World War.
Thank you, Alexandre. I think it'll be interesting then for the next round of questions to see what that means, frankly, for the UN and the World Bank. Also, I say politically for both institutions. Michael, can I turn over to you to also speak to this issue of potential opportunities, political, economic, and otherwise for these countries? How do you see that?
First of all, I'm grateful for Alexandre being here, and since alphabetically his name starts with A, I want every question to initially be addressed to him, and I'll follow up, because I would like to be number two, and I want to be fair about this. Okay, and so I appreciate jumping in, because he's always given me something now to think about. First of all, I think you're absolutely right. We're going back to some of the common European and also American ways of looking at the political economies of countries, and certainly the strategies. Okay, when I worked in Libya, I was first there in 2006. I was there during the Gaddafi regime, working as a consultant for the Brits, and then I came back at World Bank and doing different things. I kept on thinking that what we're doing is repeating something from the 19th century, from the Ottoman Empire, okay? And you go back to the statement, those that do not remember or understand history are destined to repeat it. And I think we're doing that again, certainly in some of the countries in the Middle East, at least. The Turkish involvement coming in is very huge in the Middle East and in Libya, to a lesser extent in Egypt and otherwise. And the dynamics have really shifted quite a lot in the political dynamics and the way negotiations are going. You can see that Libya is a test case for 19th century politics going on, with the US ambassador now taking the lead role, and on the shores of Tripoli to the halls of Montezuma. I mean, this is in the Marine Corps, that thing. So we're repeating something going back to the 18th century now, okay? And it just seems to be a revision of this. Now, some of the cures that I see going on there are actually more localized, okay? I don't think, I think some of the bank tools are not quite there, and I'm a heretic with that. I may disagree with you, Alexandre, on that, but I don't think they're all there. I think some of the tools are actually more localized. And it's a shame that Marwan El-Abbasi is not here, because you can ask him directly. Now, what's happening in the country that led the democratic movement? Tunisia, okay? That seems to be a country that may or may not fall in terms of its political opportunities that have come out from 10 years ago, okay? The first country to engage in the process may be actually one of the last countries to actually go back to a more centralized structure and a more autocratic type structure, depending on how you look at what's going on there. But how are some of the elements are being shaped by the regional dynamics? Tunisia has basically great beaches, good restaurants, good hotels in some of the areas in the north. You know that, Alexandre, and people that have been to Tunisia, they know that. But what else does it have? It doesn't really have like a very big economic base behind it. And the bank has spent a lot of money, or the bank has loaned a lot of money into this with very little or significant impact to justify the loans that are given there. So there's no traction there. And you can see that there's little or no traction in terms of the political, economic, governance dynamics of setting up a civil state that actually works. Now, what is the stopgap mechanism that maybe Marwan El-Abbasi could address? Marwan, it's a country where tourism is a big industry, but they're running out of foreign exchange reserves. So how did he localize and try and resolve the issue? He basically is friends with El Kabir, the central bank governor in Libya. Okay, I know El Kabir too for many years, and so does Marwan El-Abbasi. And they got the central bank of Libya to deposit $1 billion into the Tunisian central bank. That solved their foreign currency reserve issues temporarily. So there are localized stopgap solutions that other countries can do. And I think we in the World Bank, I'm very grateful for the time I spent there and all that learned there, but I think localized solutions can work very well. And localized solutions, I think, are longer lasting. That means that the individuals there, the political economies there, can resolve these issues with maybe a little bit of a catalyst from international organizations. But I think there's will there to resolve them. And the governor of the Central Bank of Libya certainly understood that. He said, if the foreign exchange reserves collapse and Tunisia collapses, we're in trouble from the other side. I mean, we got it from the Egyptian side on one side, Tunisian side. So you have these large spillover effects. Let's deal with one conflict at a time and solve one issue at a time. So the solutions become more localized. And I think in some cases, the World Bank, UN, from dragging that in, should be a catalyst in helping resolve these things in a more localized way. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Michael. This is a really good pivot actually into the second theme, which is the toolbox in the for the World Bank and the UN and other institutions. Alexandre, do you want to react to that? Because I think especially given the audience here, I think further unpacking what that could look like, any changes to the toolbox and in the direction that Michael charted for us, more localized solutions, is something that I think that a lot of people here will be interested in. So any thoughts about what Michael just said and adjustments to our toolboxes? Over to you.
Yes, so first, I fully agree with Michael. We probably don't yet have the full toolbox to be able to be very effective, but also many of the problems that we call problems of fragility or problem of tension are deeply political. And that's why it's so difficult for organizations like the UN, the World Bank, or others to be effective in those type of structures. What we forget is sometimes that there are countries that have been extremely fragile, but where there was a political dynamic inside those countries to bring them to success. And then you can see the World Bank and the IMF and even the UN very effective in this report. I take just one example: Albania. Albania, after the collapse of the wall, when it shifted to more, we could not say at that time democratic, but to a more open system, was a country that was at the brink of civil wars many times. It was, and I was working a lot on this country at that time. But then there was this idea that they could join the European Union. And the motor, the strength this idea created among the political forces in Albania meant that you suddenly, there was one thing you could not say was, okay, we're not going to join the European Union. That was another period, but still, this was incredibly powerful. And that allowed to create consensus inside the country. And then it allowed to create programs to support the governance, the improvement of the work of the institutions, the improvement of the macroeconomic policy. All that was coming very slowly and progressively in place to have the Albania that we have today that has nothing to do with the Albania of 20 years ago. So we don't often look at those examples because we look at the failure, but that was an example. But what was the example there was that actually you had enough of a political project that would bring every force together, assign this project. And then I can tell you the programs I was working in at that time in Albania, they didn't work immediately, but I think they were all relatively effective because you had an inside dynamic that was bringing people together. The second thing I want to say is that if we still don't have the tools for every situation, I agree with that, but there has been a lot of progress that has been made. And I think the progress was around one big theme, is try to bring the security, the diplomacy, and the development together. And I'm sure that's a theme that you have been discussing in the rest of the forum. This was absolutely central. So the World Bank in itself cannot do much. The diplomats by themselves cannot do much. Security answers cannot do much. But if the three works better together, and on top of that, you have a political direction in the country that is sufficiently powerful, then you can actually do quite a lot. And the World Bank had prepared a strategy, the first strategy for fragility, conflict, and violence that was issued. That was actually the last thing I was really involved in when I left the bank in 2019. 2019, it was issued. And now the IMF is actually just proposed to the board its unique, a new strategy on fragility, conflict, and violence. And it has, all of them have this type of specific issue. You have to work much more closely with the UN and the multilateral, the diplomacy, and the security actors. This is really important. You have to try and let the country be able to facilitate a political process that would take you out of fragility, knowing that the World Bank is not the best place to do it. And then you need to see the things not in a narrow lens. Development is political, development is security, development is also, has all sorts of elements that are not, it's not a neutral area of intervention. And then you need to be able to work on the global impact of conflicts in other countries. You need to work on the issue of refugees. You need to work on the issue of displacement of population. You need to work on all those issues that were before more or less forbidden to the World Bank. So the World Bank has evolved enormously. It has under its IDA program special windows that allows you to do things that when I started at the bank, there was we could not dream of doing them, right? Special allocation for countries in conflicts. Before we used to cut funds of country in conflict. Today, you still have a lot of problems, but normally you're supposed to be able, if it's an IDA country, that means a poor country, you're supposed to provide, you are able to provide much, much more resources, both for budget balance of payment support and for development program. So I think we have evolved a lot. But one big issue, if I can have 1 minute more, is now the geopolitics that comes in. Because never we saw China, and never we saw Russia, and never we saw a few others regional power like Iran or Turkey or other, so powerful and so interested in moving into this field that was before the prerogative of Western nations. The development aid was really, since the end of the Cold War, of course, because during the Cold War, it was also the prerogative of the Soviet Union, but since the Cold War, it was mostly a Western nation business. This has changed today. China is coming in and in some country has much more money to give. And it does not play, that's the problem, it does not play by the same rule. It plays sometimes by the same rule, but not always. And that means that this idea of a coherence of Western approach in some countries can be put in question very, very easily. Thank you. Sorry, it was long.
No apologies. You raise a number of interesting issues. I want to make sure there's enough time for Q&A, but you keep bringing up issues that I want to follow up on. So thank you also for raising the issue of the evolution of the thinking, and not just the thinking, but the doing at the bank and including at the IMF. I would also highly encourage people here who haven't seen it to read the IMF evaluation. I think that was done in 2018, Michael or Alexandre, if I'm not mistaken, that looked at the IMF's performance in fragile state and issued a number of recommendations that, as you said, Alexandre, are being followed up on. It's a really interesting, I wouldn't say 180, but it's certainly a shift for the IMF as you described it, Alexandre. And I think, we have a number of people from the UN here, both people who work in the UN as UN staff, but also member states who work at the UN. And this idea of coalescing or converging around a single political strategy is music to some ears. But again, this was also, I think, a long evolution for the institutions. Michael, can I ask you to add anything you may want to add on this evolution of the bank, of the IMF, and notably some of the tangible changes in approaches in fragile states in Africa that you think are meaningful, need to be known about, and or even outstanding weaknesses? Because you started us off with references to the inadequacies in the toolbox. Anything you want to build on what Alexandre said? Over to you.
Well, yes, I do, and I really like listening to Alexandre, and I want to exchange email addresses and phone numbers afterwards. Okay, I'm working with the Middle East Institute out of Qatar on different things too. Your former brother organization, so I really would like to exchange ideas. Let me go back to having worked in many fragile countries. I think people would say I'm suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, or I'm just basically weird to begin with. Okay, but I think the one element that I've actually kept with me throughout my entire career, and this goes back when I was, doing a lot of stuff in Eastern Europe, actually, when the wall came down, even prior to this, is I think the name President Klaus of the Czech Republic, when a lot of people were going in there, he came up with a phrase that I've kept with me my entire career. He said, "We're tired of paying hard currency for soft advice." Okay. And I think that is really the element that I keep with me in my entire career. And I keep asking, when we do IMF programs or World Bank programs, are we actually doing more than just providing soft advice going there? Because that's what the people are doing. I think we've moved away from a lot of this soft advice kind of stuff coming there, but we're still not focused enough about some of the issues going in. I think the World Bank, in my estimation, coming out, tends to attack issues on a very broad issue in fragility in other places. And I think potentially they may be better off narrowing and targeting it a little bit more. Okay, that's just my personal opinion to pick something up. Now, I think I really like the discussion of security, diplomacy, and development together with the IMF strategy. Frank Bousquet actually shifted from the World Bank and he took his entire work program and moved to the IMF and said, here's the IMF's work program. So there wasn't a big step. He just took his material over there and just said, here's the IMF. But having worked for the IMF, I don't know if you did with Alexandre, I think there also needs to be a cultural shift. You can actually just send a document and say, here's our new strategy. But there needs to be a cultural shift in general from the IMF. And I speak with somebody that's worked with them in the Afro-Tax Center there. IMF, when we were working in Libya, okay, I didn't know how to work in Libya on this issue. We brought people from the East and the West together in conversations. We were like Bedouins moving to Jordan, Turkey, all these different places to have these meetings that were below the political level because we felt that we didn't want to lose control of fiscal or monetary policy. We wanted to have some engagement going forward that some of the levers can be controlled so the economy didn't spiral all over the place. That was the main deal. And I remember the first meeting, I turned to one of the IMF representatives because we were organizing the meeting. I was the concierge, okay? IMF wanted shirts cleaned, we got shirts cleaned. IMF wanted hotel room, we got them hotel room, okay? Because they didn't know how to work in this, and neither did I, okay? But, you know, and then we started out and I think we were the only ones that got budget information, fiscal information, monetary information for the last 5-6 years, and we put it together. How do you create fiscal and monetary policy when you have 2 central banks, 2 fiscal policies? I mean, I don't know, okay? I still don't know. And I know that we had to engage in conversations with people and they were literally shouting at each other. We had 4 or 5 day meetings at a time. And like I said earlier, I was more of a marriage counselor trying to deal with this, you know, like, please, you know, like, and a boxing referee, no fist fights, but just trying to deal with this stuff. And I think the IMF, World Bank, I was more used to this because I'd spent a lot of time in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I've worked in these kind of environments. IMF itself as an institution may talk about change, but they need to change some of the internal dynamics of the people so they're not only going to the capital cities, and they really need to understand the political economy of the country more. And I really believe that the World Bank itself needs to put political economy as the overarching principle in a lot of the programs going in. I think a lot of the program design, we have the risk assessment there, but it's still not complete in understanding political economy and how to go forward. I don't think we understand all the actors. We need to understand that better to have an impact, okay? And the IMF itself, I mean, trying to get the IMF to come in, you know, I think they're very good. The IMF, great writers, great thinkers, great economists, and everybody great straight throughout. But they got to think this stuff isn't normal, okay? So you got to come and start thinking really outside the box, okay? You know, you can't say, well, we want you to reduce your money supply. Well, you have 2 central banks. How are you going to do that? Okay. So, I mean, you have to get the IMF to think a little bit more creatively outside the box. And they also, I think, I'm not prejudging them. I know they're making dramatic changes, but also that institution seemed to go more to the capital cities. And I think in some areas, they need to go back into the local level, into the countryside, to really understand the impact of what they're trying to recommend, and also to understand where these policies are going. The World Bank, the same. We cannot stay with the ministries at the higher level. We've got to go back to the subnational level to understand what the people want. In Libya, for example, I think our failed effort is we didn't understand what the people in the South wanted, okay? I didn't understand what the people in the Southeast wanted. Now, I think our problem, and I go, Alexandre, the Libya program, the initial country engagement note, okay, I thought was more like a Europe First program when we put it together. Why? Because Donald Trump was in power in the United States and he had an America First program there, okay? And I think we were trying to address refugee crisis moving to Europe, okay? So this, to me, we designed a country engagement note that looked to me to be like a Europe First program. How do we stop migrants to go to Italy? How do we stop them to going north, okay? And we didn't really think about, we tried, I think, with the country director at the time, to use IDA resources to really deal with the issues in Chad and other places. But Libya was kind of the middle ground here where we had to do this. the program, the IDA funding didn't allow us to deal with that because a lot of the migrants coming up were from Chad and other areas, Eritrea, whatever. So we weren't allowed to be flexible in that area, okay? I think we have to understand the regional nature of conflicts too, to understand, to be more flexible with the IDA financing going forward. I think, let me just leave it at that for right now. I don't mean to go on forever, but let me just leave it there and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, a lot in there, and I think the participants here will particularly appreciate the reference to political economy. And indeed, I want to bring up an effort that was done to the point also that Alexandre made about the integration and these different institutions working together, which was a year and a half ago during the pandemic. Actually, it was exactly what you described. It was the IMF, the World Bank, and the UN, the political side of the UN, not just the development side, both. So you had the resident coordinator and then you had the political side coming together in a few countries to actually share analysis. And the question was, can we help governments and these countries anticipate the effects of, in your words, Michael, the advice you're offering, the social effect, even the security effect? It was really interesting, and I think that's exactly the type, I think, of exercise I think you're alluding to, this coming together of expertise and different dimensions and anticipating effects of advice provided. I want to ask one last question before I open it up to the group, if you don't mind, because Alexandre, you talked about the new geopolitics, and I was wondering, kind of big picture, if you can both speak to what that means for the World Bank and the IMF. What are the long-term implications for these institutions, or even for other institutions, the EU, the UN, when you have an increasingly complex context and you have, I hesitate to say new actors because, Michael, you brought in a refreshing historical perspective, but you have other actors who now have much more weight, influence, and maybe different ways of doing business, who are part of the space. And so what's the thinking within these institutions about what that means for their operations, how they should position themselves, what kind of new partnerships, anything you want to share with us in terms of the implication of this new context or evolving context on the institutions that you've worked with or for? I was going to send it back to Alexandre, but maybe Michael, do you want to start? Or should we keep the same order?
I'd like to, okay, let me start, because then he can critique my stuff, and I think that's only fair, okay, in this one. Okay, on this one,
thank you.
Long-term implications for IMF, World Bank, I don't know. I think the World Bank and the IMF have become a lot more flexible over the years and need to continue on this flexibility, okay? Just remember that 10 years ago, when Dominique Strauss-Kahn was actually the head of the IMF, okay, there was, previous to his coming in power as the head of the IMF, they were actually reducing structure, reducing staff size, okay? Because people were wondering, does IMF have a role to play? Because everybody was going into the bond markets and the capital markets, and everyone says, well, we don't need the IMF anymore because the capital markets are there, we'll take care of everything, okay? But what transpired over the last few years with Greece and other places is the IMF, the biggest borrowers are the European countries, not the ones in South America, Latin America, or the Africans. It's the European countries that are the substantial borrowers for the IMF funding, which dramatically changed some of the games and dramatically changed some of the functionality of the IMF. Now, the IMF and the World Bank are dramatically moving forward and changing some of the ways they do business, which is really appropriate. But I think from my perspective, and I would fall back on Alexandre, and I please hope you support this because I know you would, I think they both need to really get back into, and I keep emphasizing, really bringing out a lot more in the political economy and understanding the nature of the economies and the various dynamics that take place there. Now, you bring up COVID-19. I was in lockdown in Tunisia, okay? And let me give you some of the, from my perspective. I locked myself out of my flat and I couldn't get my keys in there, okay? A very personal issue. In order to get that done, okay, I had to contact a friend of mine who was working for the UN, who had a contact at GIZ who had a permit to move in Tunisia, to drive the car anywhere at night, to go to my landlord to get the keys. So this was a tremendous event. Then the person got the keys back. It took an hour to arrange all this stuff, complexities of 3 different agencies, a bilateral, a multilateral, and the World Bank, to get my keys from the landlord to get in my place. The gentleman comes, okay, and then I finally get keys coming, and the police from Tunisia then stop by, okay? So because people are driving, we're out there in the COVID. They asked us, obviously, what we're doing there. They asked us, I paid the gentleman who drove and got my keys, and the police basically said, well, how are you going to make us feel good? Okay, so I actually had to open my wallet to help the police feel good about being there at the time. This was the day after that the World Bank passed a program on governance in Tunisia. Okay, so I think, and then Marwan asked me when I told him this is, well, how much did you pay the police? And I said, see, this is a very Tunisian thing. It's not a question whether you pay or not or good governance. It's how much do you pay, So I still don't think we have a good understanding of the root elements of how economy works, okay? And when we bring in programs like on governance, and we pass this governance program, and the day before I'm paying Mordida, the bite, like in Mexico, to get the police officers there, I think we need to understand much more how to do that. I think we have to focus our programs a little bit more, IMF, World Bank. And I think what they've done now, okay, COVID opened the doors. They've done a great job on COVID. They did a great job in trying to be flexible about the borrowing. They took out surplus borrowing capacity in Tunisia and reallocated the funding. But now, as Malcolm X would say, the chickens are coming home to roost. You have high debt levels in most of these countries. So the IMF is Tunisia, Egypt, all these debt levels are really almost above sustainability levels. When interest rates go up, now we're going to have to renegotiating the programs. So the chickens are coming home to roost. We were flexible on one side, but we really didn't capture the elements on the other side, what it means when it stabilizes. Now it could be a very interesting cycle of what's going on. Alexandre, I've left you the hard part, so I just opened the door for you. Please help yourself. Over to you, please.
First of all, I want to say that more flexibility is always, I will always agree with you for that we need more flexibility. But I want to take another dimension of this discussion about the geopolitics. The problem that we have is that the World Bank and the IMF and the regional organization and part of the UN and all that, these are global, they were designed as global institutions. Actually, in reality, with the exception of the UN is different, but the World Bank and the IMF have become very quickly the institution of the West, right? Because Russia was actually hoping at the time of their creation that they could benefit from money from the IMF for the reconstruction and after the war. But it's only very few countries of the socialist bloc that were able to benefit, Poland and a few others. So it aligned. And then when the wall fell, everybody came to those institutions, right? Russia, we thought that we had, to paradise the end of history in terms of institutions, international institutions, that we would have those as dominant. But what happened very, very quickly is that it was clear that the US and the European were not very comfortable of letting the countries that had more and more economic power also getting the normal political power they should get to in those institutions. And they were probably right, probably not right. They were worried about the nature of the governance of China, the competition and all that. So China was and even Russia became contributor very important contributor to the IDA program of the World Bank that is for poor countries, right? So they started to be contributor, but they wanted to be more involved. They wanted to be more involved. When China realized that they will never going to be more involved, they started to create their own parallel system. So they created their own financing for development institution. Russia tried to do the same, but they just don't have the money. So Russia does not really count in terms of international development. It counts on a few places because of their bullying approach and their military might that they can bring to a few countries, right? But China represents a huge amount of resources. And it's true that they were never given a chance to have more role. The world has changed since the head of the World Bank is always an American just nominated by the President of the United States. There's no, and the head of the IMF is just a European. That was maybe fair enough at a time where, you know, 2/3 of the resource of those institutions were coming from the Western Bloc. But it's not the case today. Those countries have much more role. When they saw they could not have more role, they started to become competitors. So now what we have, they don't say that, but in reality, in a number of countries, we have China becoming the competitors of the World Bank, of the IFC, of other organizations. They try to keep the connection with, but when they want to penetrate in the country, they don't care about what the World Bank or others says. They just penetrate with their investments and others. So we are in this new world of collaboration, competitiveness that makes things very, very difficult. A country like Zambia was out of reach of the World Bank and the IMF for so long because China had so much money to give to this country that they didn't need to go. And then when China realized it was too much cost for them, they start to move out, and then the IMF was brought in, and it was a total mess. So the Zambia story is actually a story that we should be very careful and think about it, because it had a long-term impact. I think China is much more smart and playing much more smart than actually Russia is playing, and is trying to, you know, to compete, but still not to completely antagonize. And it realized that it needs a certain good image in the countries they're working in, which Russia really, frankly, don't care. So they need that, and they will continue to be careful. Actually, China reschedule their debt quite often. We always believe that they take assets when when the debt cannot be paid. It's not true, actually. China had very little case of seizing assets of countries when the debt was not paid. They were rescheduling, but they still are not on the table when we discuss about fragility. They're very little on the table when we discuss about conflict, though they're the #1 contributor to the peacekeeping operation now. So we have a very complicated story. It's dramatically different than 10 years ago.
Great, thank you, Alexandre, and thanks for painting. I mean, with great clarity this complex picture. So now I want to open it up for comments or questions from the audience. We've addressed, or our panelists have addressed a number of issues, notably the opportunities in some of these countries that the current context affords, what can be done by these countries and with support from international institutions to weather these turbulences, the changes in the toolbox, the integration, the collaboration between these institutions, and finally, kind of the big picture, the new geopolitics, and what this means for the bank, the IMF, and frankly, some of the institutions that you represent here today. So I'm sure they'd also be interested in your thoughts on this. So floor is open for questions or comments. And again, if I can ask you to introduce yourself before your question or comment. Alper, over to you. And Michael and Alexandre, maybe we take first round, 3-4, and then and let you answer. Is that okay with both of you?
It's okay with me as long as Alexandre answers all the questions first.
Sounds good. We'll make sure.
Hello, my name is Alper Sezer. I'm from the Turkish mission at the UN. And I want to thank both panelists for their interesting insights. I want to react to one comment by Michael Schaeffer. He mentioned that Libya might be a winner in the current situation given Russia's attack on Ukraine and the oil prices going up. But I found it a bit contradictory in the sense that given the current circumstances in the country, we see that especially like the oil sector is heavily politicized, especially by the military regime in the east, led by Haftar. And it is also useful to keep in mind that most of the oil ports and oil fields are controlled by the Wagner Group, actually, in Libya in the east and in the southern parts of the country. So it is perhaps not a coincidence that right after Russia's attack on Ukraine, oil production in Libya went down substantially because there were some popular unrest in some of these oil producing areas. So it's more of a comment rather than a question, but I want to also highlight this part of the situation in the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Here, sorry, if you can just wait for the mic right behind you. Then just show of hands, if I may. Okay, so we'll take four and then go back to the panelists.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thanks so much for this very interesting introduction to a topic. And my name is Tizvik Medjoglu. I'm working in the EU delegation, but I'm not an economist, more on the political side. So I learned today a lot. I have three questions. The one is, how do you see the institutions being working more on the humanitarian development and peace nexus, and how you see that coming? The second question I have is, you mentioned about China, it's really interesting, but also you mentioned that the World Bank are working also on preserving, if I understand well, human rights. I'm a human rights, also I'm working in the human rights section. So I'm just wondering how you could stop or you could address the issue of China penetrating into markets, and sometimes they don't follow the same values or rights, etc. And the final question, which is a little bit rhetoric and for the future, is how do you see Ukraine war fall out and how this will damage fragile states and the poor and the future interventions? Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have Henri.
I want to thank the panelists for the very interesting conversation. My name is Henry Burgard, and I work for the UN in Colombia, the UN verification mission in Colombia. My first question would be to Alexandre Marc, as a specialist for fragility and conflict and violence. Where does he see, like looking ahead and trying to anticipate rather than respond? Where should the international community focus? I'm talking in terms of regions and maybe beyond, like the geographical, in terms of sectors. Where could that be? And the second question would be to Michael Schaeffer. Building on what actually Alexander Marc mentioned about the international institutions, the lack of the fact that they represent some very specific countries. I liked your mention of local solutions. Do you really think these institutions can propose these local solutions, and would you have other examples? I mean, because that would take away from them some of the clout that they have. Thank you.
Martin Veles from the United Nations. Thanks so much for being so candid with us today. And thanks so much to Michael Schaeffer for sharing his personal experience when it comes to providing humanitarian aid while trying to fight corruption in Libya. I have a question to both of you on innovative ways of fighting corruption. If you were paid hard currency to give even harder advice, what are good anti-corruption initiatives you have seen work out but not being rolled out enough around the world? That's my first question. And my second question goes to innovative ways of funding. The RC for Yemen just launched a campaign to crowdsource international support. So thinking about public-private partnerships here, crowdsource international funding to address an oil tanker crisis in Yemen. Have you seen other creative, truly innovative, truly outside the box, not 18th century style ways of funding to address peace and development issues? Thank you.
Thanks, Marc. All right, Michael or Alexandre, if you want to go first. I won't summarize the question, but I've listed them, so I'll make sure they're, if you haven't done so, that we address all of those. Alexandre, where do you want to start?
Okay, this is a lot of question. I don't know if I can address all of them. Let me take a few of them where I think I have more of a capacity to answer. The one is the development peace nexus. So, you know, what we were always arguing when we were working on peace is that there's not a development peace nexus. There's development has to, peace is one dimension of development, as peace should be one dimension of security, and peace should be one dimension of diplomacy as well. So the nexus is really, I think, between development, diplomacy, as I was saying, and security. All this should come to contributing to peace. Now, what we have done in the report, the UN World Bank report on Pathways for Peace, was really to try to document very systematically what we mean by a development program that actually supports peace. And you know, the World Bank has engaged in the poorer country. I'm saying that because, for example, unfortunately, Libya was not didn't have the resources because to do this type of program, because this was for country that were called IDA country, that means the poorest countries. There was programs that were created based on a strategy that was a prevention of conflict strategy. And we looked at things like, for example, you always need to fund the border areas, right? We tend to, and I'm sure the colleague from Colombia will agree with that, we tend to forget the border areas because we concentrate so much on other areas, but that's a very important dimension of development for peace. The second dimension that is very, very important is to look at where the grievances of different people are and to make sure that their development program are not pushing on some of the grievances, even if the overall community can be positive. For example, developing a mining area, developing a mine very rapidly into an area because it can grow the GDP, but then you create huge local grievances around it. So all those things that are pretty automatic when you think about, or you can see quite clearly when you work in the field, are actually the elements of peace into a development program. And I think in countries like Niger or countries like Burkina Faso before the coup, the bank has tried to reorient its financing into those type of area, as well as UNDP, but also many other organizations. So that's for the development peace nexus. The human rights, I think, is the central piece of what is happening now. Because I think the problem of the geopolitical competition that we talk is very much around human rights. So what it is that why don't you trust China is because you don't trust, if you look at democracy and participation in government as one of the human rights, then you will see that that's on the human rights standard that we feel that China might not be able, will not behave in the way we would try to behave, though the West does not behave always in this way, as we know very well. But still, this is I think this is the central issue, is this issue of human rights today, and how much do we keep to the values of human rights. And I think the big danger of what is happening now is that because of geopolitical region, we tend to shortcut our human rights. And you can see it already, because we start to become much more softer now on Venezuela, for example, on its human rights standards, because you need the oil. And the more you're going to have those type of tension, the more this issue about human rights will become central in what in the way we decide about our intervention. I'm just going to take a few, because if not, it's too difficult to answer. But what direction the international community should be going? I think Michael said something very, very important. We should not, despite the horror of all what's happening of Ukraine, we should not forget that there's other horrendous conflicts happening in many other places in the world. And the worst that could happen is to drop the attention to them, because they could in the future become much worse than what we see in Ukraine in terms of human toll. So we should be very careful about what's happening in Eastern Africa, around Ethiopia, Sudan. We should be very careful about what's happening in Mali, in all these areas, in the Sahel. And there's a big risk that we change the attention. So we need to remain on focus, I think, on some of those issues that we had before the Ukrainian war, and not rechange everything because of the Ukrainian war. But I know it's very difficult to say that because of the huge change it represents on the international scene. Local solutions, I really believe in local solution. I don't believe that the World Bank would have any problem with local solution. The problem is, do we have the tool to make those local solutions work at the local level? I'm not terribly sure that we always have the tool, because most of our program there are some program at the local level, but there are governmentally central program, but we have experience of trying to support, we had experience of trying to support local solution, but I really agree that a lot has to be resolved at the local level. I think I will stop here, because if not, I think I'm going to take all the time. And I'm sorry for Michael, because I left him with a lot of questions there.
This is Michael. This is Michael Schaefer. I was expecting you to take all the hard questions, actually, and I'm deeply disappointed, because you're kind of you're the leader.
You've got the corruption question, Michael.
Oh, that's simple. I can handle that. Just give me 10 seconds and a bottle of beer, and we're done. With respect to the gentleman from the Turkish embassy, let me just deal with this. Winners and losers in Libya is kind of a odd concept. You still have two governmental structures now, the East and the West. And I think we're seeing, using a French word, déjà vu, all over again. We're going back to the same thing that we had in 2013, 2014, bifurcated fiscal policy, bifurcated monetary policy, and General Haftar there, and also other issues that never seem to go away. But the Russia-Ukraine crisis is expected in the short term to have a positive impact on both fiscal and current account balances in Libya, quite frankly, because oil prices are going up. They're a net exporter of oil, and so they're going to benefit quite significantly from the amount of money coming in. I just remember 4 or 5 years ago, World Bank, and I was part of that team. We were basically sitting there. What happens when Libya runs out of foreign exchange reserves? And they were at 60 billion. This is significantly more than Tunisia. And we said, if they continue this pattern where where they don't rebalance their exchange rate, or et cetera, they'd be running out of foreign currency reserves. So that's what I meant by that. Okay. And so I think they're gonna still have to pay more money for wheat imports, but in the near term, they may be a net benefiter because of the oil price hikes coming through, and that's what the export. And so I think that's where they're there. I think Libya itself is a longer term political solution. I started working in Libya when I was 5 years old, and as you can see, my hair is grayer. I've lost most of it during that period of time, and it just seems to go on and on and on. So it's a very difficult country to work in. With respect to, I want to deal with just a couple of things, World Bank and preserving human rights. This to me is really a very difficult process there with the World Bank and working with humanitarian organizations, because World Bank is more of a development institution rather than kind of a short-term humanitarian institution. And I think the World Bank is really doing a phenomenal job in terms of moving towards providing broader range of services on the humanitarian side. However, there seems to be some sort of misunderstanding, like in Yemen, the World Bank was basically a bank account for donor funding to the Yemenis, to Yemen. Okay, so then effectively all the UN agencies started coming to the UN started going to the World Bank for funding. The World Bank is not a funder in that sense. Okay, they were basically a trust account for donated funds, and so there was a misinterpretation of that. And I think the World Bank has difficulty doing some humanitarian stuff because it really isn't set up that way. Okay, it's set up to do more development and reconstruction rather than humanitarian, but it's still, I think many people are trying to address those issues. Okay, now I believe in you know, I think we're all preaching to the converted here. Top-down approaches, which is what generally I think the IMF and the World Bank engage in, need to be accommodated with bottom-up approaches from local governance going forward. It's not sustainable if it doesn't happen that way. But I think some of the institutions need to change how they approach projects and going forward. IMF would come more at the national level, negotiate with central bank, Ministry of Finance, and not broadly with other institutions going forward, because that's not their main counterpart. But somehow in this mix that Frank Bousquet is now leading in the IMF, you're seeing a much more flexible approach with the IMF to discussions on programs and things like that going forward. Now, I love this question on anti-corruption initiatives. Okay, speaking as a person who paid money the day after the World Bank had a governance program going in Tunisia, I feel myself as an expert. Okay, and I've done this in Mexico and other places, and I'm sure Alexandre, you've done this in other places too. You know, I mean, seriously. I mean, I remember in Georgia the same thing. You know, like seriously, we're talking about you know, mordida, bribes, and all this kind of stuff. And I recently spent a lot of time in lines in Tunisia. You know, I'm a public finance management primarily specialist, and I'm a big on transparency and accountability. And what I work on in many countries is the chart of accounts, the budgeting, the financial systems. Okay, and in Libya, trust me, we've tried now 3 times. We have a chart of accounts that we tried to design for the national government. We've had 3 efforts at this. Okay, and we can't get agreement on the kind of a chart of account specifications to go forward. Okay. Now, why is this? Okay, you know, I know that what is it they say? Economists are like accountants, except we have more personality. So, I mean, I think we have I'm not an accountant by training, but I have personality, and I assume that the Libyans would want more transparency and accountability, but I'm not completely convinced. Okay, and I don't mean to be heretical here, but you know, I think some structures work in the absence of full transparency. Okay, no matter how hard the World Bank and IMF push, I mean, there are elements there that work on a parallel way without fiscal transparency, without any transparency. I believe that you need to have that in place. You need to have leaders in place to run this anti-corruption program, and it's broad-based. But I think we have to get to the broad element of restructuring the political economy of the country to do that, and that's a longer-term effort. With respect to one other thing, I think, let me just go, where do we see public innovative way for public-private funding? I want to get to that very quickly. I think the World Bank and IMF is out because they have their own kind of funding mechanisms. But I think the World Bank is actually trying to do that now with different various trust funds, a little bit much more flexibility in the IDA funding. I think that's really clear. I think I agree with Alexandre on this one, that the IDA funding that they have is very appropriate, but it doesn't apply to middle-income countries. Okay, just try and apply it to where most of the conflicts are now, the middle-income countries. Libya, $8,000 per capita GDP. Okay, I mean, you can't use IDA funding for that. It's below 2,000. Okay, so how do you take these kind of creative mechanisms for financing and going forward. It's really, really tough, especially when the market essentially for dealing with the fragility is increasingly becoming middle income countries. Okay, so I think we have to rethink that a little bit. Okay, and I think how we do that is going to determine. I think Kristalina, who's head of the IMF and used to be the CEO of the World Bank, is trying to loosen the strings of the lending process. Okay, but at the same time, if you loosen them, you create other things down the road, like substantially more debt. I think we're going to get into in the future a little bit more debt sustainability work. Okay, maybe something like that. Over to you, please. Let me just stop here.
Thanks, Michael. I think there was another question as well, but kind of more, again, big picture about the future of the war in Ukraine and its impact on the fragile states that you're working on or working in. But maybe we can park that as your final thoughts, final conclusions. Maybe if I may, though, on just stepping out briefly of my moderator role on innovative financing. And I don't know, Michael or Alexandre, if you've worked on those, but the development outcome bonds that UN agencies are now using, including the least innovative organization in the UN universe, which is UNRWA, the Relief and Works Agency that provides support to Palestinians, is looking at working with the bank and other institutions to access financing through these development outcome bonds. And I know some peace operations are even looking at that for generating extra resources. Where I mean, we can take this offline, but that's another thing that perhaps it's been there for a while outside of the UN universe, but for the UN, it's something that UN entities are looking into. Okay, let me ask for a second round of questions and or comments, and then we'll start wrapping up.
Thank you to both panelists for your thoughts and your on-the-ground experience sharing, and your openness about the difficulties, of course, always appreciated. I was wondering, oh yeah, sorry, I'm Sammy. I'm from the German permanent mission here to the UN. I was wondering, we've focused a bit on the tools, right? And both of you have said that, yeah, there should be different approaches, and we should get away from the state-centered approaches sometimes and look at more localized tools, but they're not quite there yet. And you've both been quite open about them not being there. And one experience while I was working in Lebanon on Syria, but also followed what was happening in Lebanon, was there was a World Bank program in relation with the Syrian refugee crisis in the region, offering both Jordan and Lebanon good, pretty, impressive funding opportunities for infrastructure projects, hospital, health, identifying the needs of both countries and where there could be pretty serious injections of funding for such large-scale projects, including job creation. And there was a huge difference between Jordan really readily accepting this offer and going for it, and then Lebanon not really advancing. And it's unfortunately a recurring theme, but we have many countries like that. I'm not trying to single out Lebanon, but not really, even claiming that money, even coming up with plans to get access to that funding. And I think that's an issue we'll have in many countries where the state isn't necessarily always interested, unless there's something that incentivizes them to go for that path in providing this, service to its own population and so on. So my question would be, is there really no thought on other actors? Or are we two state centers, the UN, World Bank, IMF, everybody else, to not come up with identification of other legitimate actors? I'm not talking about private sector necessarily, but like cities. We've had the discussion about cities and the role of cities, identifying tailor-made solutions in the country you are. Who can we work with? Who's generally interested, even if it's within the government, one branch, and then really just come up with adapted models. Again, I know it's a very complicated matter, but maybe you have examples from the countries you've worked on where something like that may have worked and could be replicated in other contexts. Of course, adapted to the realities there. Thank you.
No, Okay, so back, and I'll have one last question for you, picking up on a previous question, Michael and Alexander. So back to you with Sammy's question on how can we get away from this state-centered, state-centric approach? Are there other actors that we're forgetting that we could partner with to have greater impact in fragile states? Alexander.
Actually, I know quite well the programs because we were providing a lot of support for those programs. And I would say that unfortunately, that's why the program in Lebanon of the World Bank is much less developed in Jordan, because each time you have to see what's in for each of the communities of the Lebanese political system, and you have to negotiate that. I myself worked for many years on a program for local development that at the end was refused because it was not clear how much each of the communities would benefit for the exact amount of the money that was going to go in the country. So this type of things, and I'm sure Michael will have a lot of stories on that. But the problem with the World Bank and Development Bank is that on one side, it's been great to develop a system like that, that when you think about it is in many ways self-financing, right? Because for middle-income country, it's loans that are given back, but even for poor country is actually a very cheap solution for many of the donors to fund development, because there's no overhead, there's no, it works like a bank, but when you work like a bank, you need to sign with somebody, and the whole idea is that we were going to sign with governments. So what made all those development bank innovative and so powerful in development was also what is a little bit their weak point, is that they have to get, if not working with government, they have to get the endorsement of the government. And that means that there are a lot of things that donors can do themselves, working with NGO, other groups and all that, that is very difficult to do. This being said, you can do them with governments that are progressive, but it's like my example on Albania again. You are managing to do things with countries that actually already have the solutions to get out of their problems, because they're already ready to work with other levels, with cities, with others and all that in ways that are very innovative. And therefore, when you come with the development, they said, yeah, why not? Why don't you give money to this city? Why don't you work with this organization? But if a government does not want at the beginning, with the World Bank, it's going to be extremely difficult. The fund that we have that you can use without government approval. Even the program in Yemen, there was no more government. The government was sitting in Saudi Arabia. We needed to get the provisional government to agree on passing it through UN organization and others. So just to say that, and I don't know if you want me to say something about Ukraine, or we come to that later.
Well, you can do it now, Alexander.
Yeah, so I think Ukraine is going to be is going to represent a very important shift, and it's going to represent it's actually what was transpiring and coming up slowly the last 10 years, and it's going to have a much stronger alignment of countries around their political preference, I would say, that we have managed to, that we were managing since the Cold War, more or less, because first of all, there was this huge increase in democratization in the world, and we were believing that with development, democracy is the logical next step. And today, democracy is not the logical next step of a country on the path of development. So we have a problem there. And we have a problem with the values that we believe are really important, even if ourselves, we have not respected them all the time, but around human rights and all that. And if we end up reorganizing the world around who supports us and who does not support us, I think it's going to be a very, very different world in the future. But I know that everybody is trying to avoid that type of situation, but at the same time, it will be a logical situation. But I think we still have to see how all this develops.
Thank you, Alexander. Michael, over to you for Sammy's question on partners and other actors that the IMF and/or the bank can work with, and then as well, if you want to offer concluding remarks, just going back to the initial question around the impact of the Ukraine crisis on fragile states, and maybe some crystal ball gazing on your end to help us conclude.
Yeah, I think people know me well enough now after this hour that I know I do a little free ranging and I do a little big picture stuff every now and then. So let me do that a little bit now. Let me deal with some of the financing aspects. First, you mentioned UN bonds. Okay, now for that I go back to 1811, Alexander Hamilton, when he basically created the first U.S. government bonds. The only way he did that was he actually had a revenue source where he agreed with the state governments that they would that the national government of the United States would take all of their state debt and finance it with a US government bond, and it would be financed with a federal tax on whiskey. Okay, so he created basically, I think, the single most achievement in unifying the state governments under a federal government structure. Okay, and he did it by having a financing source to offset for the payment of the bonds. That's really important. I don't think Europe has been able to create a European bond with a single basis of tax to pay back the bond. So it shows it's very difficult to do in many cases. So when we discuss like UN bonds necessarily, I keep wondering, I think that's a great way of maybe financing things, but how is it going to be financed? Where is it going to be financed? And I think that really brings, I mean, you have no taxing authority. So how is that going to go? So it's a bigger question that's being raised here. I think the World Bank and the bilaterals have done quite a significant amount of work in actually doing what is called monoline enhancements. They basically insure some of the bonds that are being issued. For example, France basically issued a guarantee for an Iraqi bond several years ago, okay? And so it's on the French books to do this. So I think there are creative ways to do that with bilateral guarantees, even monoline insurers like MBIA, which is private sector enhancer. You can do different things and use these kinds of financial vehicles that are already there to do this. I'm not sure a UN bond would work because I don't know where the taxing authority would come from or the revenue authority would come from, but it's something to consider. So I think there are various ways to go forward, and I think that would generate a lot more cash to go forward. On some of the big picture issues, okay, Ukraine is a tough one. I've worked in Ukraine a long time ago. I can freely admit that they have great borscht. I really like it, and I'd go back for the borscht. I don't mean to be that flippant, but they do. And I think this is going to be a very difficult time in the next few years. I mean, you've read maybe the World Bank papers, the IMF papers talking about high inflation, high debt, things like this too. This is going to have a major impact on all of the smaller middle-income countries, not only in terms of sourcing foodstuff, inflation, but and refinancing debt and bonds. You're already starting to see this tumble. I mean, Tunisia is the first of the new democratic things from the Arab Spring that is now on the verge of either going autocratic or going democratic. Okay, and I don't speak for Tunisian government, I don't speak for the central bank, but this is a very challenging time for this country. And if they can't resolve that issue, it's going to be very interesting to see how the world community will actually deal going forward with some of the other countries down the line. So I think one has to take a look at that. I'll turn it over to Alexandre to answer all the harder questions and yourself. And thank you very much for having me here. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So we have a couple of minutes left. So Alexandre, any final thoughts on these issues, including the long-term impact of the current crisis? You've already alluded to some of the geopolitical realignment, but over to you for any concluding thoughts, and then we'll close at 2:30.
Yes. So so I think we are at the moment where there's going to be a lot of redefinition that will have to happen, and aside from the dramatic economic impact, right, and financial impact, and impact on availability of grains and all that, right? So that is going to create for sure a huge. Some countries are going to benefit, but some countries are really going to lose that. So that was, I think, we started. Now we come 300-degree circle, right? That was your first question, I think. But the impact, we still have to see what it's going to do for the fragile states, especially the one that are highly food dependent, who needs to import their food, the one who are not energy rich, the one they are not, but there's also, I was talking with someone today about everything. People think about the impact of Ukraine, everything, on everything. Someone was working on lithium, and I was talking about the impact of lithium, and they said, yeah, but I mean, for the batteries, there's a big worry about what's going to happen, not with lithium, but with nickel, because Russia is one of the big producer of nickel. And then you have other place where you're going. So where is that going to come in the supply chain of goods? So we don't know how the world is going to come out of this conflict. We don't know how. A big question is, how is China going to play its game there? But anyway, we are in an age of big power and regional power confrontation, and that is going to only reinforces it. So I think I cannot say how it's going to go into the future, but I think we're going to have a really difficult time, and it's going to go much beyond just the conflict in Donbass. It's going to be a much broader wave of impact where many things will be redefined, but I don't know in what way.
All right, thank you so much, Alexandre, and thank you, Michael, for both of you for being available today. As someone said, for sharing really candid reflections on and connecting the dots between technical issues around World Bank and IMF products and approaches with the geopolitics of it all. We really appreciate it. Was really good to have the perspectives of from the Bretton Woods Institutes, or at least two people who are intimately familiar with those institutions. So on behalf of the whole group here, thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting.
A wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.